This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this episode 959 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's sleeper show was a little disappointing. The quarterback streamers were fine, but none of them were great. I'd call it a pretty mediocre week on that front. Nick Westbrook-Akine did nothing, Dontavian Wicks, Elijah Moore, and Wan'Dale Robinson were kind of bleh, and the deep sleepers of Trey Tucker and Parker Washington, they were bad picks. Now on the plus side, I had one of the best sleeper calls of the season with Tim Patrick. Sincere McCormick had a decent day, and Brandon Cooks found the end zone too. I talked up Isaiah Davis elsewhere, but didn't have the Breece Hall information by the time that this show went out. So I wasn't able to officially lock him in as a sleeper, unfortunately. It was a pretty bad week overall, though. It's the fantasy playoffs now, so I really want to end the season on a high note, so let's get to this. But before we get to the sleepers, I want to remind you to check out Underdog. Right now over on Underdog, you can enter into snake drafts for this week's slate of games, but there are playoff contests available for you too. If you think you have a better grasp on the league's playoff picture than others, then you can have a serious edge right now in those contests. To check them out and more, head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. When you sign up, of course, use promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a really nice deposit offer, as well as my rest of season rankings if you still want those. That's UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. Now, as usual, we'll start with a look at players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and we'll look at quarterbacks. And we'll start with Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers had his first 300-yard game in ages last week. He gets a Jags defense this week that's the best matchup in the NFL for quarterbacks. On the season, the Jags have allowed the most adjusted fantasy points to the position. They lead the league in adjusted passing yards allowed too. The Jets have an okay enough 22-point implied team total, so I think Rodgers can find your lineup as like a QB2 this week. Jameis Winston as well. The Browns get the Chiefs, and Kansas City has been a slightly above average opponent for quarterbacks this year. Cleveland has an implied team total over 20 points, so it's not like sports books think that they won't be able to score. And look, the bottom line is that Jameis Winston has gotten it done since becoming a starter, at least from a fantasy perspective. He's averaged over 20 standard fantasy points per game, and his average opponent has ranked 23rd in adjusted points allowed to the position, meaning they've been far below average from a matchup standpoint. Kansas City is 13th, so I think Winston is a solid enough bet this week. Now at running back, I'm going to just quickly call out Patrick Taylor if Isaac Guerendo can't go on Thursday. At this moment, I don't know if Guerendo will be in or out, but if he's out, I'd anticipate Taylor getting most of the work in that backfield, or at least leading that backfield in touches. And the Rams are a pretty average matchup overall for running backs. Next is Sincere McCormick, who still needs to be rostered in way more leagues. The Raiders get the Falcons, and Atlanta's low-key actually been pretty good against running backs this year. It's their secondary that's the bigger problem. But even if Alexander Madison's able to play, the Raiders may just give McCormick a shot to be the early down guy. That's what Antonio Pierce essentially said on Wednesday. And it's a game where Vegas is only a 3.5-point underdog. Maybe this game ends up being closer. That matters a lot because the Raiders have used Amir Abdullah as their pass catcher even during the Sincere McCormick stretch. So I have McCormick as a higher-end RB3 this week. In that same game is Tyler Algier. Because there's a chance that game script doesn't go the way that we think, and Atlanta does do well against the Raiders, Algier could be in play. He's seen running back rush shares of 29%, 23.5%, and 36% in 3 of his last 4 games. Vegas is a team that you can definitely run on. They're below average in running back rush yards allowed versus expected, and they rank in the top 10 as an opponent for running backs in adjusted points allowed. Now, Bijan Robinson should have a big day, but Algier might be able to sneak in 8 to 10 carries. That makes him a deep league flex option. And then a more obvious sleeper this week is Isaiah Davis. As I said in the 50 transaction show, the Jets really made their backfield a 50-50 split this past week without Breece Hall. And it's not sounding great for Hall this week. And the Jets get the Jags, the second best matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed. Braylon Allen is obviously in play, but this is a great spot for Davis in your flex too. Now, wide receiver this week, even if Ladd McConkey's back, I don't think Quentin Johnston is a terrible play. And Josh Palmer works here too. But QJ had a 24% target share this past week without McConkey. Palmer had a season-high 31% target share. And now they get a better matchup this week against the Buccaneers. It's a team that ranks as a top 10 favorable opponent for wide receivers by adjusted points allowed. If McConkey goes, I think there's way more volatility, but they're still viable in deeper formats. The Browns could be getting Cedric Tillman back this week, but like I've talked about before on the show, each of those wide receivers, they play a specific role in the offense. For Elijah Moore, it's more of a slot role. He's usually in the 60 to 70% slot range, more than Jerry Jeudy, more than Cedric Tillman. Well, the Browns get the Chiefs this week, and Kansas City is the number one team in adjusted slot target share allowed to wide receivers, meaning teams against the Chiefs are using their slot wideouts more than usual. A lot more than usual. And that could really benefit more this week, especially with David Njoku now banged up. Now, another slot matchup to target this week is Demario Douglas. He's averaging a target share per game rate of about 22% in completed games with Drake May. And while his ceiling hasn't been super high, his floor is okay in PPR formats. This week, the Patriots get the Cardinals. Arizona hasn't been a great matchup for wide receivers this year, but they've allowed a well above average yards per route run to the slot, as well as the seventh highest adjusted target share to that area of the field. Douglas has run 78% of his routes from the slot this year, so the matchup is there. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine did not come through last week, really for the first time in a while. He also saw just a 6% target share when he had seen 3 straight games with at least a 20% target share. This week, the Titans are involved in a game with a 46.5 point total. That's not bad for them. And they're 4.5 point underdogs against the Bengals. There could be a negative game script involving more passing. And I don't think the 6% target share that Westbrook-Ikhine saw last week should be considered the norm. He still had a 91% route share. So I think he does make some sense this week. I think a lot of times we just assume that teams who are big favorites are only going to run the ball. Like Baltimore this week. Yes, they'll probably have a low pass rate, but you've got to create a good environment in the first place. You have to score points to get to the point of running the football. Now, I bring that up because Rashad Bateman is facing a Giants team this week that ranks dead last in the league in deep ball completion rate allowed this year. And Bateman's number one on the Ravens in average depth of target. It sounds like his knee issue is now behind him, so he's a high variance play for week 15. Zach Ertz is an easy go-to for me this week at tight end. The Commanders just lost Noah Brown. They get a Saints team that ranks as a top 10 favorable opponent for tight ends this year by adjusted points allowed. Ertz has seen at least a 20% target share in each of his last 4 and 6 of his last 7. He's in a great spot. Now, I like Ertz more than Hunter Henry, but Hunter Henry's in play too, solely due to volume. His matchup's not great against Arizona, but he's seen target totals of 9, 8, and 9 over his last 3 games. He's accounted for about 25% of New England's targets during this time. He's still under that 50% rostered mark, so he works as a sleeper. We'll now take a look at players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues, so we're digging deeper here. Now, at quarterback, I don't mind Bryce Young this week. I'm not a betting tout, but I do think this 42.5 point total is a little bit low considering both of these teams, the Panthers and the Cowboys, they run at a decent pace. Dallas is the 4th best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed, and Bryce has played so much better over the last month, and he's averaged 17.5 points per game over his last 3. And Cooper Rush belongs in the discussion too. Carolina is the 6th best matchup for quarterbacks, and the Cowboys had the best pressure rate matchup in the league this week. That's in terms of how much pressure the Panthers generate and how much pressure the Cowboys give up. Rush is certainly not great, but he's averaging about 15 points per game as starter. That's not horrendous. So as a dart throw, he does make some sense. I've got Jerry McNichols in this tier because the Commanders are pretty big favorites over the Saints this week. And we've seen it with Washington this year. They won't be afraid to give their backup running back some work if this game is out of reach. Not only that, but McNichols could just see some work naturally with Austin Eckler sidelined. New Orleans is a top 5 matchup for running backs, and they've allowed 11 more running back rushing yards per game versus their opponent's season-long averages. So you could look McNichols' way. Sean Tucker's the other running back in this tier, only if Bucky Irving doesn't go. The Bucs get a pretty mediocre matchup against the Chargers, but I would imagine that Tucker could see some short yardage stuff and maybe double-digit touches. He did see less work last week than we'd probably want, even when Bucky was out, but that's why he's a deep sleeper. We at least know the ceiling is there, given what he did earlier this season against the Saints. Now, like I said earlier, Noah Brown has an injury that's sidelining him, and I think Dyami Brown is the direct one-to-one replacement there. Luke McCaffrey's a slot player, while Noah Brown has run just 19% of his routes from the slot this year. Dyami Brown is at 21%. The Commanders get a Saints team that actually has struggled against the slot, so keep that in mind. But they've just been beatable in general. They rank as the 12th best matchup by adjusted points allowed. The Commanders have a healthy implied team total over 25 points, and the pressure rate matchup is pretty good here, which may allow Brown to get down the field and make one of those splash plays that we've seen him make in the past. He's a pretty high variance sleeper, but he does make some sense. And then if you want another big play guy, Marvin Mims. Yes, Marvin Mims. I don't feel great about it either. But Mims saw his route participation rise to 42% the last time we saw the Broncos. That number had been closer to 25 to 30% most of the season. He also has hit a double-digit percentage target share in 3 of his last 4. He's getting a top half matchup for wide receivers, and Indianapolis has been below average at stopping deep ball completions. He's a Hail Mary, almost literally, but that's why he's a deep sleeper. And then at tight end, Stone Smart. Will Dissly's doubtful this weekend. Smart was the one who stepped in last week and ran the most routes at tight end for the Chargers outside of Dissly. He made a super athletic catch. He got 3 of 3 targets for 54 yards. Now the Chargers get a matchup against a Buccaneers team that's given up the 7th most adjusted points at tight ends this year. He's definitely in play, and that's especially true if Ladd McConkey is out. Now, as for our defensive streamers, I talked about Washington earlier this week. They're in play. They work. I also don't mind the Falcons against the Raiders, the Bengals against the Titans, and the Cardinals against the Patriots. Now, I know the Cardinals burned you last week, but New England has had trouble protecting their quarterback all year. Now, looking at some underdog picks, let's go to Zach Ertz. I'm going to go higher than 36.5 receiving yards. Noah Brown being out, good matchup. The only fear here would be that they go with a really run-heavy approach, which is very, very possible. And then I also like Bryce Young higher than 204.5 passing yards. There could be a lot of plays run in this game, and he's been north of that mark in 2 of his last 3. He was about 15 yards off of it last week, but he was also going up against the Eagles. This is an easier matchup than that. You can use those picks if you want to. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. When you sign up, you know the promo code, Late Round. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you had subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. I'm on Blue Sky as well with the same handle. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag episode, and then there's another episode of Late Round Perspectives. I'll be in your ears then.